Good morning or good afternoon to everyone joining us, and a very warm welcome. My name is Cymroan Vikas. I'm a Senior Manager for Market Intelligence at auctusESG. And today, auctusESG and the Asian Bankers Association is delighted to welcome you to the launch of our joint publication of a climate transition roadmap for bankers in emerging markets. This report provides step-by-step guidance on how bankers can initiate a climate transition within their own bank's operations and business. This webinar will consider, the strategic and operational challenges in generating internal buy-in, challenges with borrowers, especially borrowers in hard to abate but economically critical sectors, and challenges in facilitating climate projects that banks in emerging markets are likely to face. From the discussion, we hope to see some useful strategies, case studies, and recommendations that can support bankers to begin their climate transition journey. So we have a great agenda for today's webinar with some great, fantastic speakers. Let me give you a quick breakdown of the plan for the next hour and a half or so. We will first begin with a welcome address by Mr. Austin Chang from the CTBC Bank and the ABA, followed by a presentation from Mr. Sourajit Aiyer, one of the lead authors of the joint report, who will present the key insights and recommendations from the report. Then we will dive into the panel discussion with Ms. Anjali Tarpur from HDFC Bank, Ms. Suloshni Naidu from the DBSA, Mr. Adisha Pereira from the Union Bank of Colombo, and Mr. Manish Kumar from ICICI Bank. At the end of the panel discussion, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. However, you are welcome to put your questions in the chat during the course of the presentation or the panel discussion. With that, let's begin with the welcome address by Mr. Austin Chang. Austin is the Chief Strategy Officer at CTBC Bank and Chairman of ABA's Policy Advocacy Committee, with over 16 years of experience across strategy, management consulting, M&As, and banking. Austin leads ESG and climate risk management initiatives at CTBC, setting the bank's sustainable finance strategy and driving large-scale reskilling programs within the bank. As chairman of ABA's Policy Advocacy Committee, he leads the discussion and dissemination of critical issues within policy and regulation to national and international governments. With that, over to you, Austin, for your welcome address.
Greetings, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar. I think we can all agree that climate transition has become a universal challenge across all sectors. And I believe that one thing that we may all agree upon is that financial sector can play a pivotal role in driving sustainable development. And this brings us to today's report launch and the panel discussion, where the practitioners will explore how banks can make holistic effort toward this goal. And before to dive in, I would like to briefly set up the context. Through my role at ABA and CTBC Bank, I have witnessed firsthand the growing importance of climate transition and the unique set of opportunities and challenges it presents for banks in Asia. On one hand, we are well positioned to play a crucial role in financing the transition to a low carbon economy. With deep understanding of local markets and our ability to reach a vast customer base, we can catalyze investment in sustainable development. However, the path to climate transition is not without its hurdle. Banks often grapple with the limited resources, emerging regulatory frameworks, and the lack of climate-related expertise. Additionally, the risks associated with climate change can pose significant threats to our long-term financial stability. Today's webinar will present the report, The Climate Transition Roadmap for Emerging Market Banks. This comprehensive study developed by auctusESG provides a clear and actionable framework for banks to navigate the complexities. Following the report presentation, I look forward to the panel of discussion between seasoned practitioners from banks across various markets. I look forward to learning from their unique perspectives and approaches. I believe that by working together, we can create a more sustainable and resilient future for our markets and the planet. So I encourage you to participate actively in the discussion, and let's make collective efforts toward this goal. So now it's time to dive in. Back to you, Cymroan. Thank you.
I would now like to invite Mr. Sourajit Aiyer to present the insights of the report. Again, a very quick introduction. Sourajit is Vice President for Sustainable Finance and Climate Strategy at auctusESG. He is a finance and climate professional with over 17 years of experience in the finance sector and has worked extensively with bankers in many emerging markets. And Sourajit has previously worked with financial institutions such as Motilal Oswal Financial Services, UBS Investment Bank, eValueServe, Grameen Capital, and UNEP Sustainable India Finance Facility. So with that, over to you, Sourajit.
Now, climate change is really the new mega trend with the potential to really impact business risks and opportunities in very similar ways that we have seen previous megatrends, the way they impacted the sector. So in case of climate change, what really happens is, to just put it in a nutshell, climate risks really leads to damage of or the stranding of financed assets. It causes a lot of disruption to business continuity, supply chain networks, worker productivity, and so on. And as and when businesses become negatively impacted because of these things, the banks that lend to those businesses are also impacted. Let's move to the next slide. So in this context, given this backdrop, we prepared this report really as a detailed guidance framework, if I call it that, to facilitate or help bankers in emerging markets to plan, develop, and implement a holistic climate transition strategy. Most of you would know that emerging markets, developing countries really rank much higher on the climate vulnerability indexes. And at the same time, a lot of solutions that are coming out globally are more pertaining to the Western markets rather than to the contextual issues of the emerging markets. And that was really the gap that we wanted to address. So based on auctusESG's engagement with several banks in this particular emerging market region as part of its advisory and training projects, it was quite clear that a lot of the banks in these markets were at nascent phase of the climate transition journey and really wanted to know more about the how aspect rather than the why aspect. And in line with this need analysis, the key recommendations and considerations listed in this report really aim to serve as a practical roadmap for bankers, outlining what are some of the key activities and the sub-activities within it to navigate the climate transition journey, while at the same time operating within the boundaries of business growth and financial performance, because obviously you cannot compromise one for the other. Now, with this, I'm pleased to announce the launch of this report, and which we have prepared in partnership with our colleagues from the Asian Bankers Association, and my sincere thanks to them. And I will request my colleagues to paste the web link of the report in the chat box for all of you to download, and I will request all of you to share this web link onward with your colleagues. Let's move to the next slide, please. So, while, like I said, this report has been prepared by auctusESG in partnership with the ABA by leveraging our previous experiences, engaging with bankers, etc. It is also really strengthened by inputs from several senior bankers from across diverse markets, each of those institutions is seeing certain activities play out in their bank's climate transition journey, whether in their bank or in the sector overall. And this map is really to just give you a visual representation from an optics perspective of the markets where these contributors were based in. Further, a Google survey link was also shared with some bankers, and the final report has been peer reviewed by senior experts from the banking and the sustainable financing space. So all of this was really aimed to make the report more practical, more relatable, more contextual for the industry players. Next slide, please. So a quick look here at the various primary research contributors, and we convey our thanks to them for giving us their time on the calls. Let's quickly move to the next slide, please. So this slide is really to give you a quick overview of what is the science telling us. I won't take much time because a lot of this is already there in broader media and news reports. Just want to assert that physical sciences rather is telling us that climate issues are emerging as a key business risk, and that will continue to remain so and grow unless some corrective action is taken. Now, what this really means is it's not something that is going to happen in the future. It's actually already happening around us as we speak, especially in a lot of extreme weather phenomena we have seen in this current decade itself. And that is seen by the scientific data that is coming out in the graphs that you see on the left of the screen. And as I said before, a lot of emerging markets, developing countries remain more vulnerable to climate risks, as seen from the data on the global climate risk indices that you see on the right of the screen. So all of this makes it an urgent issue because even, do remember that even corrective action would actually take a substantive time to show gain. So it is a very imperative issue. It's an urgent issue. Next slide, please. So the transition of economies from a high carbon to a low carbon model in line of, with these growing risks from extreme weather events is further driven by a lot of mandatory commitments to nationally determined contribution goals, net zero pledges in a lot of countries. And these goals, these pledges are really, expected to drive the future direction of public policy in those markets. There are other drivers like pressure from regulators, pressure from institutional investors, development of cost-effective technologies, the desire to create a first-mover advantage in a competitive market space, and reduce exposure to carbon-intensive assets from a reputation standpoint. So a lot of these drivers are playing together in varying degrees in different markets, and that really sets the pace for, or rather the motivation for banks to look at climate transition journey. Next slide, please. So in the context of all these drivers that we spoke about and the demand or the lookout of banks to ensure climate transition within their business strategy, this report recommends 5 key activities that address the various dimensions or the sub-activities of transition planning and implementation, as you see in the waterfall diagram on the screen. Essentially, these broad activities include aspiration, the initiatives for execution, the evaluation of the progress, the setting accountability and responsibility, and engaging with key stakeholders. Now, while the broad activities may sound very familiar that you have probably read in many places, it is really the sub-activities that we want you to focus on. Each of these headline activities has several sub-activities that we will touch upon, and this is further strengthened with some case studies of banks that have been added wherever that information was shared publicly by those banks. Next slide, please. So the first element is about aspiration. So what do we mean by this? Now, under aspiration, we're really talking about sub-activities like first is assessing the landscape. What are the policy trends that are expected? What are the policy trends that are happening? What is the current exposure of the banking portfolios? Where do you think the risk would lie based on those policy trends? What are the broader business goals of the bank itself? So all of these comprise an initial landscape assessment. Now, that's typically followed by stakeholder feedback, not just on what stakeholders are expecting around this theme, but more importantly, what is the expected risk of delayed action and how that would impact the bank itself, the business model of the bank. So the aim is really to identify the high impact sectors for transition that are contextual to the business model and the strategy of the bank itself. Now, the next step is using these landscape findings and the stakeholder feedback. How do you create a compelling business case to put forward for the climate transition strategy based on business risks and opportunities? So essentially, the idea is how do you showcase the long-term protection to net interest margin, to profit margins, despite all this shift in portfolio composition? In line with the business case, the idea is to use the business case as for the next step, which is to secure the buy-in from the board and the C-suite management. Now, in most emerging markets, given that a lot of banking portfolios have a high exposure to a lot of carbon-intensive assets and sectors, because that's the way the the economic development or the economic growth journey of a lot of these countries started out. A lot of these assets are all still in their investable life. So it creates getting the buy-in a very challenging task, especially in emerging market context. And that is where the business case of what is the gains from it and what is the gains that can be accrued by transitioning well in time rather than going for a delayed transition is really going to play a big role. Then next, based on the nature of the buy-in, the idea is to set a very high-level aspiration of where the bank really wants to reach from a practicality standpoint. And that high-level aspiration will then be further broken down in the next step, which is on the initiatives in terms of individual activities. And once we have all this landscape assessment, stakeholder feedback, business case development, engagement with the senior managers, setting of high-level aspirations, the idea is also to match this with what we have access to currently in terms of resources. So what is the current toolbox of resources, tools, internal capabilities that are available? And that is what, sort of creates a bucket list of the necessary resources. Next slide, please. So on initiatives, again, sub-activities like setting up of internal policies and guidelines to create the architecture boundaries within the bank systems and processes. Exclusionary screening is often one of the first steps towards portfolio realignment, but it is not completely sufficient to make the banking model climate smart. And that is why we move to the next steps eventually down the line, which is firstly on baseline assessment to understand where does the bank currently stand in terms of portfolio exposure and where and to what extent it may need to work on to create a more climate smart business model. This may cover sectoral locational analysis, green asset ratio, carbon footprinting, and so on. Further quantifying of climate risk by using probabilistic weightage-driven risk scoring models for climate risk, especially transition risk drivers. This is where climate scenario analysis to gauge the probable impact on business, the counterparty businesses, and their credit worthiness and interest coverage ratios really comes into play. Based on all this quantification, setting up of time-bound and science-based targets in line with both the high-level aspirations that we spoke of previously and the current baseline and risk scoring that we are doing in this particular activity. That said, targets should be timeline-based and staggered accordingly. Finally, integrating climate risk into the credit underwriting processes and overall business strategy. Now, this activity is also where a lot of banks are currently exploring innovative instruments such as sustainability-linked loans to incentivize their counterparty borrowers to also achieve emissions reduction, because reduction of financed emission for banks is a huge component of managing climate risks. Next slide, please. So on evaluation, this really comprises of a lot of activities related to setting up of metrics and targets to track the progress and make periodic assessments for implementation, because that would really facilitate any course correction that is required midway. And it would also help demonstrate tangible and verifiable progress, which is important for credibility of the climate transition journey overall. The other part of this is to set the coverage of this metric. So what are we really covering? Now, one classic example is of emission targets. Do we look at emission intensity targets or do we look at absolute emission targets? Now, which of these is really going to reduce emissions in the broader economy in the long run? Which of these may often be used to sort of create instances of greenwashing by basically playing with the arithmetic, the arithmetic of ratios, so to speak. So it's really important to analyze what is it we're wanting to cover and what is the long-term goal to do so. The other part of here is to set the review cycle. So both long-term strategic reviews and the more frequent short-term operational reviews. So long-term reviews is where the targets may often be recalibrated based on what is the evolving climate sciences, what is the evolving regulations in the market, what is the change in the law of the land. And these reviews would need to be aligned with the bank's current resources or capabilities in terms of data systems, organizational capabilities, and so on. So obviously the latter may need certain investments to match in line. And the last element here is about assessing the trade-offs, because obviously balancing business goals along with climate transition goals, there may be certain short-term negative impacts. And the idea is really how do you sort of make up for those losses through gains in other ways, like reputation and branding gains, etc., to make up for that short-term impact to business goals. Next slide, please. So the next activity is on responsibility. And here, really, the idea is to set up robust governance structures, accountability mechanisms for oversight. And this would be through governance framework. I see someone's raised their hand. Can I just request if there are questions, you can just put it in the chat box and we will pick it up as we go along. Thank you. So, so essentially, setting up of governance structures is really about ensuring board level oversight and putting in place cross-functional committees with clear roles, responsibilities, and reporting lines to ensure that coordination happens between departments properly, because ultimately climate transition is a change management strategy, and any change management strategy has to flow down, it has to percolate across all the departments and the hierarchies of the organization. An important element of responsibility is also to align executive remuneration with climate risk reduction KPIs, especially in context of what is called LTIPs or long-term investment incentive plans, with clear quantitative targets and a reasonable weightage to those KPIs. And this would need to typically encompass the broader staff hierarchies, rather than just be limited to the C-suite leaders for it to really percolate and show effective impact. Last but not the least, enabling an organizational culture that recognizes climate transition as a mainstream business priority. Next slide, please. So the last activity is on engagement. One of the most important engagement is with regulators, because their role as a facilitator is critical to close a lot of the challenges that are related to climate transition, like data access to government operated weather data sets, borrower data, by ensuring that regulations compel the borrowers also to track and disclose their emissions information, and drive clear-cut disclosure requirements instead of open-ended disclosure requirements that leaves too much to the discretion of the banks. Another very important engagement is with the borrowers, because obviously the bank's financed emissions comprises a disproportionate share of its emissions profile. And so the effectiveness of a bank's transition is linked to the alignment with its client decarbonization strategy. And it is critical that large carbon-intensive borrowers align with climate transition, because otherwise the banks would struggle to realize their own goals. Last but not the least, engagement with capital market, brokerage analysts, and fund managers, because they are the ones really covering the listed banking stocks and are really have the wherewithal to sort of put together how the integration of climate risks into the financial models or the financial valuation models would be done. The scientific, academic, and the media community is also very critical to develop and propagate the entire messaging or the data development and the messaging around this particular thematic area. Next slide, please. So this slide really summarizes some of the key questions that banks may want to consider, why and how they want to integrate climate transition into their models. Really, a lot of questions around the business case, the policy mandates, the competitive advantages, the long-term financial performance impact, and available methodologies. Next slide, please. So the next two slides, this is really summarized. It summarizes the recommended activities and sub-activities into a checklist format with stages of completion related to when these were discussed, planned, implemented, reviewed, and achieved. Let's move to the next slide. The checklist continues there. And the idea is really, this checklist is also there in the report. The link to the report is pasted in the chat box. And this checklist is really to be a useful ready reckoner for bank managers to track the climate transition journey within their banks across all the activity areas. Next slide, please. So to summarize, this report really provides a detailed guidance framework that may serve as a practical roadmap for banks in emerging markets as they navigate this journey, and by addressing the contextual issues that institutions may face in this process, the report is really trying to empower them to develop and implement effective climate transition strategies, and ultimately contributing to the broader goals of a low carbon future for the business community and the planet as a whole. Let me take this opportunity to quickly introduce you to Ms. Siloshini Naidu. She's the head of ESG at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. DBSA works across several climate vulnerable countries in the Southern African region. We also have Ms. Anjali Tarapur. She's the head of ESG at HDFC Bank. HDFC is India's largest private sector bank by assets. And just to add, India, for instance, ranks 7th most vulnerable in the climate risk index globally. So a very important market and a very important bank. We also have Mr. Adisha Pereira, head of sustainability at the Union Bank of Colombo in Sri Lanka. He's also the core group member of the Sri Lankan Banking Association's Sustainable Banking Initiative and a member of the Climate Action Steering Committee at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Manish Kumar. He's the head of ESG and CSR at ICICI Bank, India's second largest private sector bank, again, a very systematically important bank in the country. He was previously the CRO at ICICI Bank's London office, who brings in the regulatory experiences from those markets as well. Just to quickly add, the panel discussion will form a round of questions to the panelists, and we would, like I said earlier, we would request if any member in the audience has questions, they could type it in the chat box and we will pick up towards the end. So with that, let's start off with a common question to all the panelists, starting with you, Siloshini. So essentially, when we talk of banks advocating for policies that balance business interests with climate action, how should they prioritize this? How are banks going about prioritizing this? Is the priority really to define what is meant by climate-aligned projects firstly, or is the priority on policies to expand the bankable pipeline, or is the priority to first mobilize funds with a low cost of capital, or is the priority around influencing the bank's senior management to give a buy-in? How is your bank approaching this? Over to you, Siloshini.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I think that's a really tough and a loaded question. I hope, Sourajit, I do it justice. But, you know, notwithstanding the context of South Africa, where coal is still underpinning the energy supply in the country, it's been a challenge. However, the South African financial sector quite broadly have been quite ambitious in terms of its ramp up towards renewable energy and other green investments, such as, you know, your nature-based solutions more recently. From a policy and reporting perspective, I would say it has really matured over the past few years, you know, especially the last 4 years, I would say, where the banks started with the GRI and the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and then it evolved into the more granular requirements under the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, which has since been taken over by the IFRS through the S2 Climate-Related Disclosures on risk. As we attempt to move closer to the net zero targets, it becomes really a balancing act between keeping the international commitments and lenders happy, and then balancing the needs on the socioeconomic side within obviously all the jurisdictions in which we operate. So on the point around where we are most focused on, I would say in terms of the transparency, defining climate-aligned projects have been keeping us quite busy of late, mainly because of the transparency that our stakeholders demand. We receive funding from the likes of the GEF, the GCF, And therefore, that comes with great responsibility in ensuring that we have, the right governance in place internally to ensure that the assets that we label as climate friendly are in fact climate friendly. I think you mentioned earlier the greenwashing aspect, which has become quite important. Then a solid governance and eligibility criteria does enable us to remain accredited to these agencies year on year. This invariably allows us to access concessional finance or funding with eventually, that lower capital cost, lower cost of capital. In terms of senior management buy-in, we recently, say March this year, established a dedicated EXCO subcommittee that's specifically dealing with ESG sustainability matters across the organization, both at an operational and a lending level. This will now enable us to specifically focus our EXCO management team into the ESG policy and other related matters across the group, which they have now become accountable for. They've not become accountable in terms of their scorecards as yet, but that remains a work in progress. So I hope I did justice to your question, Sourajit.
So essentially, a larger focus on defining the area, because that would provide credibility to get a lot of the other things moving. If that's one way to. I'm summarizing what you said. Anjali, moving to you, how is HDFC Bank approaching the same issue? Your comments, please. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Sourajit. So, to my mind, I think the climate agenda of the banks broadly fit in within the governance pillar of the banks and the regulatory landscape. So on the governance side, I think the important aspects really entails is what is the buy-in on climate change at the board level? What kind of oversight does the board have on climate change? What are the expectations of the board for management on climate change? And finally, from a strategic perspective, how does the board perceive the opportunities and risks? Now, when one's looking at banks specifically in India, I think the governance aspect has certainly happened across most of the banks. Even though the regulatory framework is still at a consultation stage, the good part is that the broad contours are known, and there's also likely to be a phased timeline that will happen in. So when we're specifically focusing right now on the climate transition, on the transition financing, which is part of your report, Sourajit, I think if you are a bank that is focusing and has a large wholesale lending portfolio, then the natural trajectory is for the bank to position itself as a preferred bank in transition finance. On the pricing front, I think the greenium has not really played out, but we perhaps can live with this. Now, specifically on the green transition, while projects will increasingly gain traction, it would help in India if we had a green taxonomy, because that would bring in some element of standardization across the sector. Thank you.
Thank you. So the taxonomy really connects with what Siloshini was saying earlier about the precedents for defining it firstly, because that really sets off the tone for a lot of other things. And what we're taking from what you said is a very top-down driven agenda. So getting the buy-in, which will essentially, when the comfort with greenium is not there, then the regulatory mandates has to compensate for it. And that's really one interesting finding we found from what a lot of bankers that we spoke to also as part of the report making, the role of the regulator. And that's why we've put an intersection of the role of the regulator, even though the report really primarily targets the banks. Adisha, let's move to you. Sri Lanka has, gone through a lot of economic turmoil in recent times. But despite that, it still released the sustainable finance taxonomy during this period that, in a sense, both Anjali and Sulochini have alluded to. How are the banks there in Sri Lanka really approaching this climate transition agenda now? What seems to be the priority there? Over to you, Adishan.
Thanks, Surajit. So I think in your presentation, you mentioned about the unique context and the compelling business case. And you also now alluded to the economic crisis that we had here. So if you look at what happened in 2022, yes, it can be taken down to certain economic mismanagement or certain economic issues. But it also kind of shows the vulnerability of the economy on the fossil fuel dependence, right? So the economy contracted by about 10%, and it's mainly as a result of lack of access to fossil fuels. There was supply side, a lot of shocks that happened. The agri-food system, kind of the value chains did not work properly. So access to markets, value chain resilience, all of that got challenged as a result of the dependence on fossil fuel. So the compelling case for the banks here is that we must, we've gone through that, we've realized how much of a hard adjustment it is when we do not have access to fossil fuels. So the compelling case right now is for the Sri Lankan economy to move towards renewable energy integration and making sure that we build in resilience along the different value chains. It can't be done alone, and it must be something that we must collaborate on, and that's something that I think Sri Lanka we've been fortunate in. So the banking sector, all the way back in 2015, we 18 banks had come together to collaborate on sustainable banking, and we had kind of built in some level of internal capacity on green finance, on climate finance. And also the regulator here, the central bank, had also progressed. In 2019, the regulator had kind of declared sustainable finance roadmap. And as you mentioned, Surajit, central bank had also released the green finance taxonomy in 2022. That also comes with the realization that our country is in a debt distress, and we went through a default. So when we're trying to attract international capital, that it's easier if we have as I think some of the colleagues mentioned, the specific areas identified where there's a localized requirement. So the central bank, with the support of IFC, had developed this with a lot of stakeholder consultation here, and they've identified what are the aspects for adaptation as well as mitigation. But as I mentioned earlier, in the case of Sri Lanka, given the crisis that we had, there is urgent mobilization on making sure that we move on the adaptation side, on the resilience side. So that's something that I think, as individual banks, we have to look at kind of how we really internalize it. But as a sector, there's a lot of progress happening, and I think you mentioned one of the pillars was on engagement, and that's where a lot of activity is happening in Sri Lanka. Many of the banks are engaging with the regulator, with the industry, and I will, I think, in my at a later point, go into depth of what are some innovative measures that are being taken up here.
Thank you, Adishan. That's an interesting point, because we find a lot of conversations happening on the mitigation on hard to abate sector, industrial sectors, and the fact that adaptation resilience is often seen as a more lower cost activity to propagate climate action is often gets overshadowed. And I'll come to you later on this topic of resilience. But meanwhile, Manish, we've kept you waiting for long. What are some of the things that ICICI Bank is doing in terms of this prioritization issue? Over to you, Manish.
Hi, welcome all, and I thank auctusESG to give me this opportunity to be part of this publication and today being here on the webinar. So Sourajit, if you can just elaborate your question, what type of prioritization are you talking about?
So essentially, we're saying that when banks are advocating for policies around business interests and climate action, So there are a number of areas that they could prioritize, either in
Yes.
terms of definition or in terms of pipeline, funding, buy-in, etc., etc. So that is what we were talking about.
Sure, sure. So I think one important aspect which I think we heard across, my panel members is that the buy-in from the board now is kind of already behind us, and I believe several factors have contributed as drivers. One is obviously the increased awareness due to the frequency and the high severity of the climate events which are now happening globally. So it is really hurting us, and it is impacting us adversely, and I think that is one of the reasons why we can see a kind of people coming on the same platform on this. Policy initiatives is an important aspect. So a lot of governments, primarily because of the now COP becoming more and more vocal, it has become a global platform. Countries have made commitments. G20 presidency, I think, after Indonesia, in India, and now a lot of commitments are being made by several governments. So that is driving internal policy framework. A lot of task force within the country are being set up to drive the agenda, and that is also nudging financial institutions to really come along in the journey. Regulatory developments, which of course we cannot ignore that. So in India also, I think the regulators have started playing an important role. There is push from foreign institutional investors. They have spelt out their requirements based on UNEP FI, PRI, or PRB. They are ESG rating agencies, which are insisting on enhanced reporting and disclosure. So I think all these drivers are playing an important role to drive the boards in the banks. I can see, from the disclosures and interactions with my fellow banks in India, that governance frameworks have been put in place. Committees have been put in place in most of the banks. Either it will be, a directly risk committee or a separate ESG committee in the board. There are now policies at the board level which are being put in place. So either it can be termed as an ESG policy or a climate risk policy or a sustainability policy. So I think the board has started taking a lot of action. This has also led to some banks now announcing carbon neutrality target years or net zero target years. So I'm sure without the buy-in of the board, without having kind of a roadmap, these things would not have been possible. On the, I would say, senior management side, the banks have started evaluating options, and are making their roadmap in their own operations. So how to really, manage their carbon footprint, align their operations to these vagaries of nature. A lot of an entire ecosystem is now getting developed in India. There is a lot of external experts, either in form of consultants or climate tech startups, which are working along with the banks to enable a lot of this capacity building. Is I think one important area which also you have covered in your report, that in terms of knowledge per se, in terms of availability of people, in terms of technology to facilitate this has also now become a topic of conversation. uh, though in some areas support from the senior management is, I would say, uneven. In some areas, like at least technology, adoption of technology is something that we are seeing much more traction happening. Then, obviously, Adisha mentioned about various aspects of climate mitigation, transition, adaptation. So, to really facilitate that lending, enablers are being put in place, including, if required, accessing pools of capital. While there are certain challenges on that side, I think probably we'll cover it as we go on.
Thanks, Manisha. Yeah, that's a interesting point on technology being the facilitator or the enabler to close a lot of the issues and contribute towards that business case. Siloshini, let's move to you again. Your bank DBSA has made a lot of work in aligning with ENS risk criteria and safeguards. How are you looking to extend this risk alignment now to climate-related risks particularly? Over to you, Siloshini.
Thank you. And just now, I want to quickly show a bit of a slide.
Sure.
We recently, in conjunction with Oliver Wyman and African Natural Capital Alliance, published a white paper on nature-based risk and opportunity on our loan book. It was a very lengthy 2-year investigation which told us where our water and biodiversity related risk could lie, and specifically jurisdiction level. We are still in the process of incorporating this work, though, into the bank's wider ENS stress testing and scenario planning work, but it was good to establish that initial baseline. We made use of some pretty good data sets that's available in South Africa, and we use the WWF water risk filter that's extensively used as part of our analysis in-house. The results showed that water is a major risk for us, and that requires, a little bit more of risk management solutions from a credit side as well. Over the past few years, banks in South Africa also faced some extreme weather events such as droughts and floods. If a bank had extensive exposure to, say, the agri side, such as the winelands in the Cape region of South Africa, it really translated into some real financial risk for the bank in around 2020. So the bank, therefore, would need to build up such extremities into, the capital adequacy and credit provisioning processes to the extent that it is practical. At the DBSA, we're also commencing the application of ESG stress tests on the loan book and so forth. And I just want to quickly try to share my screen as well. Just do let me know if you are struggling to see it. Are we good?
Yes.
Perfect. So basically what you would note or see is that we really started with it at a roadmap kind of approach. I just want to make this a little bit smaller, sorry. And we defined it. This is obviously a kind of summary. There is plenty of underlying kind of work that's done in terms of the work that lies ahead over these next 3 years for us. But basically, very quickly, just talking through it high level, we have started and proceeded to focus in on the PCAF methodology, which is also mentioned in the report itself. So Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials to calculate financed emissions. We're working on carbon footprinting and so forth for the bank, our own facilities. All of these geared around our net zero target for 2050. Obviously, the pressure has been from us through our stakeholders on, constantly being transparent around the reporting. And you will notice that we move from a very risk data-based systems approach over these next 2 years, and then finally getting into external assurance, internal audits, and so forth. But still early days for us at the bank. These are effectively the key kind of summary tasks and alignment we're making towards international best practice. I hope I answer the question.
Thanks, Siloshini. That was a useful slide, actually. Let me now go over to Anjali. In HDFC's bank case, the ESG policies also integrating ENS risks in the lending practices. So how is your bank addressing the issues related to the pipeline of bankable projects, particularly, so that essentially the activity still meets the risk criteria while yielding acceptable net interest margins? Over to you.
Thank you. So let me put it this way. When the environmental and social due diligence was first introduced a few years ago, many customers would say, why are you making us do this? This is not required by regulation. Today, this conversation is absolutely off the table. So we have the buy-in of the clients available on the importance of doing an environmental and social due diligence. But yes, there may be a lot of issues on the quality of data. But as I mentioned, at least the buy-in is there. So at the bank, as part of our ESG risk management policy for lending, for every loan above 1 billion Indian rupees, we have a very detailed ENS due diligence, and we have an abridged version of the ENS assessment for loans that are above 0.5 billion. Now, this ENS assessment forms part of the overall credit appetite memorandum. Now, admittedly, it would be the larger companies that have better quality data coming in, and the smaller or maybe the unlisted companies is where there's a little bit more difficulty in getting the data. But as banks, always remember that the better the ESG quality data that you get from your customers, the better will be the financed emissions data that you will get as a bank. So no doubt, today in India, we're seeing a very, very strong pipeline, largely because of a very favorable environmentally regulatory framework on sectors like renewables, green hydrogen, battery, fuel cells, solar power, solar panels, EVs. And this will help towards lowering overall and moving towards decarbonization. But at the end of the day, the ENS assessments form one part of the overall credit appraisal. So I would still say there is no substitute for prudent lending practices. So as banks, we still need to be cautious not to just chase assets because they are labeled as green, but also understand that we need to equally help brown assets that are transiting to the green process. So ultimately, it's really looking at ensuring that we have prudent lending practices with the ENS assessment forming one of the criteria. Thank you.
Thanks, Anjali. So that really goes back to that point of creating a business case, not just at the level of the bank, but also at the level of all these borrowers, whether in the emerging green sectors or in the existing brown sectors, because unless everybody moves in speed and obviously facilitated by enabling policies and technologies, cost-effective technologies and so on, unless everybody is able to create a business case out of it, the economic logic of the entire climate transition somewhere gets lost. It's not the doing good aspect of it. It's ultimately a business risk. It's a business opportunity topic. So that's really why we also wanted to stress on the business case aspect of this entire thing. Moving to you, Adisha, some insights from you on how your bank and the banking sector in general in Sri Lanka is really planning to integrate climate risks into the mainstream risk management frameworks, into the mainstream strategy. What are some of the challenges being faced there? Over to you, Adisha.
So Sourajit, in Sri Lanka, many of the banks are listed entities. And the Colombo Stock Exchange requires that all the banks, all the top 100 listed entities move towards IFRS S2 climate disclosures on the opportunities and risk. And many of the banks have already set up their governance framework. Most banks have already got executive committees. So even the bank that I'm working at, Union Bank, we have set up an executive committee. And some of the banks have also set up board level committees. So my bank is moving towards setting up a board level committee. And on the strategy side, again, many of the banks have identified both in terms of their financing aspect as well as in their own operations certain targets. Many of the banks have already achieved for their own operations Scope 1 and 2. They've gone for carbon neutral status. And on the portfolio finance emissions, some banks have started calculating the portfolio emissions. But more importantly, as I said, because of the crisis that we had in 2022, on the energy security, on the food security, there is a recognition that we need to be doing much more. For example, the bank that I'm working for, we are looking at partnering with some of the development financial institutions as well as development partners. We do have, after the crisis, there are the ADB, World Bank, the multilateral development banks, as well as some of the development agencies like USAID and EU. They have started certain long-term programs in trying to strengthen the energy security and food security in the country. And what we have been doing is we've also, as a bank, we realized that some of the research that they have been conducting in the market, some of the kind of, they've also been engaging clients in borrowers on the ground, on identifying progressive clients who we can kind of work with. So it's been also helpful to get leads from some of the work that these broader programs which are ongoing, and where we've been able to grow our asset book with some of the customers who understand the risk of not adjusting and who wants to really now start to transition. So and also I think we have also set certain targets. So we are looking at adding about 30 megawatt of renewable energy through our own financing by 2030. I know it might not sound like a lot, but for our bank, given our scale, that's a target. Then we are also looking at, we also have this environmental and social risk management framework. And we are anyway, I mean, most of the banks have got support from IFC and Asian Development Bank, ADB, to develop our ESMS frameworks. And we had already, some of the criteria that we are assessing our clients on included climate risk as well. So there is some level of engagement that has happened already with clients, some level of understanding of climate risk to some degree in our portfolio. But I guess the crisis that happened showed that probably what we identified was not really enough. And especially if you take the agriculture sector, Sri Lanka had this ban on synthetic fertilizer. So overnight there was a ban on synthetic fertilizer, and that resulted in huge yield losses in agriculture. So some of these you can't sometimes. It's only when a crisis hits you that you start realizing the level of the pain that you have. And now that we have seen that in Sri Lanka, seen that happen, I think the banks want to really go there. But the challenge is, I think, in a context where your country is in a debt distress, not many international investors want to kind of invest in the country. And I think this time, where we are trying to gain international access to capital, what we are trying to focus on is developing the pipelines. So identifying what the opportunities are, developing those pipelines, and also building our internal capacity. So our own teams. I mean, as I mentioned, there are these certain USAID programs that are happening, and we are kind of relying on their support to train our staff to understand, for example, in agriculture, on certain value chains, what are certain climate resilient, climate adaptive, climate smart agricultural kind of practices, technologies that can be adopted. So there is a lot that is happening, but I guess, yeah. So yeah, I can go into more details in my next.
Thanks, Adisha. That's actually I'll take a cue from one point at one of the points that you mentioned, which is about when you said that the renewable energy target may seem small when compared to other markets or other banks. The surprising thing after engaging with a lot of banks across markets, what we realized is a lot of green related activities is happening in larger measures in a lot of the smaller sized economies who have proved more agile, and a lot of things to learn from them, and a lot of things that can be replicated from them in the larger economies in terms of provinces based strategy, if I put it that way, because larger economies are very heterogeneous when it comes to geographic diversity and climate issues across the geography. So different strategies based on different provinces becomes very relatable. So that was a point I once heard previously. And that sort of led food for thought that, each and every example is important. Each and every example is replicable in some context or the other. Manish, let's move to you. ICICI Bank has been putting in place a climate risk framework, which is considering climate assessment and integration of these issues. Now, what were some of the issues that you faced while developing these assessment methodologies contextual to an emerging market like India, especially on the data issue?
So it has not been an easy journey, and I believe the journey is still continuing. I think one of the important aspects for any climate impact assessment is having a common understanding of the risk parameters per se. And if a lot of people are familiar with how risk ratings are done, there are weights which are allocated to different parameters. So that becomes a big challenge that we are actually facing as an industry, banking industry in India. Partly, of course, because regulatory guidance is still awaited on this, and the taxonomy, which we have already discussed about. In addition to that, for climate risk assessment, peculiarities of the industry also need to be factored in. So it's not that we can apply the same parameters for a cement industry versus a steel industry versus a textile industry. So identifying those peculiarities of an industry, identifying peculiarities of a company within that industry, from a climate impact perspective, is the second challenge that we have been facing to really come up with an assessment methodology. So right now it's a hard working model. So our risk team is browsing through several annual reports, sustainability disclosures of leading companies across several sectors to identify parameters on which there is a common theme which is coming up in the sector. So what are the parameters on which companies are expressing disclosures or expressing their challenges, to say so. We are trying to understand the approach and parameters being used by rating agencies. Right now, it is more international rating agencies like S&P, Moody's. We are trying to adapt them to the India business environment. We are looking at ESG rating methodologies or ESG assessment frameworks of MSCI, Sustainalytics, CDP. There, the challenge is inconsistency in the approach. So, just to give you an example, like for MSCI and Sustainalytics, when they assess the companies, we have noted that environment amongst ESG, environment still constitutes not more than 20% in terms of weightage. So you can imagine within environment, climate will be is just one of the components. So the weightage is not clearly defined, and therefore to really extract information out of their approaches is also becoming a challenge. So just to address some of the issues on data availability, we are trying to identify credible external sources of data within the country. Of course, there is a lot more engagement which is happening with the corporates in India. As you might be aware that the reporting requirements are not yet mandatory for a lot of companies in India. There is non-standardization of the reported information. So to tackle that, we have to really make or rather engage with the borrowers. We have made sector specific questionnaires basis which an engagement is happening with corporate borrowers. When we come down to SMEs, we have to start with explaining purpose, that why is it required, why is it really relevant to their operations, why is it relevant to the operations of their industry. So that is something that first we have to tackle. Then, of course, we have to seek only the relevant information. So, really, they are not very forthcoming in sharing information, but I believe it's a journey. It will gradually happen. We are also relying on secondary research as much as it is possible. So, I believe a lot of reports which are now increasingly becoming available will help us in this journey. So I believe that the way forward is to really patiently go through the motions without causing disruption, and ultimately the objective is to support just transition. I believe there will be much more collaboration on this aspect amongst the banks, and just a word of caution here that I think integration of climate risk into core credit rating would be some time away.
Sure. Thank you, Manish. In fact, so just to summarize, really a templated approach, if I call it that way, depending on the sectors, depending on the industries, and that while that's a hard journey, like you rightly said, but that's the journey everyone needs to traverse on. Could be made easier. For example, if I take an example that is happening in a certain developing country in Eastern Asia and Northeast Asia specifically, the regulator has actually taken the initiative to put together a data utility sort of a data set from their own side of corporate level data that then a lot of the banks and the businesses can then refer to do their work on climate transition. So that is also one of the reasons why we have stressed on the role of the regulators, the role of other borrowers, stakeholders, that engagement aspect, including the alignment with the relationship managers of the bank itself, the frontline sales staff, to manage their expectations, to manage their resistances. Those things have also been highlighted. Thanks, Manish. Anjali, a last question to you. HDFC Bank has a significant share of the retail housing lending pie in India. So how is your bank engaging with stakeholders to expand the green housing mortgage portfolio particularly?
Thank you.
Over to you.
Sure. So currently, less than 5% of residential buildings in India are green, but this is changing quite rapidly. In India, land is a state subject, so each state has their own rules and regulations. But there are states that are offering some incentives on green homes, such as higher floor space index, or there could be some fixed subsidies on the capex expenses, or there are some lower stamp duties being charged. Now, the good part about green housing in India is that it's no longer restricted to the grade A commercial properties or the high-end premium residential properties. I think there's been a lot of work that has been done to encourage green building practices on standalone self-construction homes. And these are small measures, for instance, to include better designing, avoiding red bricks, use of reflective paints, cook stoves, solar panel, rooftop panels where feasible, water harvesting. These are the kind of measures that there's a lot more engagement happening with the customers on this front. So in the initial days, most certainly it required a lot of sensitization, and we managed to do that by leveraging on some of our developer relationships that have been established over a very long period of time. Now, to the credit of the multilateral agencies as well, they have been championing green housing, and they've been offering both the banks and the housing finance companies long-term funding, but it comes with some covenants that a certain portion of the lending needs to be done for green housing. I think organizations like the Real Estate Regulatory Authority can help in promoting green housing, or at least ensuring that we have a ready-made database of green housing in the country. And certainly, we are hoping to build up better data. When you look at European countries or you look at the UK, they have these energy performance certificates on their buildings, which in turn helps the banks and financial institutions to measure, for instance, their financed emissions on mortgages. So these are some of the building blocks that we will all have to work together as we move towards increasing the green housing stock in the country. Thank you.
Sourajit, I would just like to add.
Yeah, Manish.
Yeah, so I think, in addition to what Anjali mentioned, we are seeing a lot of traction, at least on the commercial, building space, because, large investors like, say, a Brookfield, are coming in, and they have these as, precondition. So that is also helping on, the other side. In addition to what Anjali mentioned on residential, or rather with regard to residential properties, now state governments have started including a lot of actionables. So, for example, in Maharashtra, they have come up, with a climate action plan. So, as part of that, they are trying to see how, water recycling or sewage treatment plants can be made part of the plan itself. So some of these initiatives we are seeing, but as Anjali mentioned, it's a state subject.
So based on what both of you are saying, essentially we go back to those points on the role of how the what the institutional investors are demanding on one side and what the regulatory landscape really lays out and that sort of paves the way for the banking strategy also on this. Adisha, I mentioned to you, we'll come to you on the resilience aspect. So, how are the banks in Sri Lanka really working to enhance resilience in that market? Are there any innovative solutions being explored by the banks in resilience building efforts? Over to you.
I mean, in Sri Lanka, many other banks have been going for syndicated loans on like large-scale renewable energy, but an area where there hasn't been much collaboration in terms of financial structuring is in the value chains. So that's where right now the banking sector, together with the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and the Sustainable Development Council, it's part of the government. So the private sector, the government, and the banking sector, we are trying to set up a blended finance facility. So there are certain transitions where there are certain viability gaps, and banks, as we are right now, given our regulatory risk parameters, we might not be able to directly kind of engage with certain risk thresholds. So that's what we are trying to see, whether we could create these other mechanisms, a blended finance facility and certain catalytic funds, where some of the banks who can participate, who to the level of risk they wish to, they could do that. So that's one area that we are looking at. The government of Sri Lanka had also at some point looked at debt for climate, debt for nature swaps, and there is also potential, apart from government projects, there's also possibility of hopefully building up private sector led projects as well. And if we can kind of build up a sizable pipeline and also look at certain other domestic development impact bond criteria, there can be much more private sector involvement going into areas of climate resilience building, where the government might not be having certain capacity, or private sector can step in. So those are some of the things that we are right now exploring, the blended finance facility, domestic development impact bonds. And also one of the important things is that the Chamber of Commerce and the Sri Lanka Bank Association, we are about to enter into an MOU to share data, share information, not in individual client level, but at a more industry level, because there is some level of data from government and development agencies, but there's a wealth of data on the private sector that we can kind of work on and have more tailored solutions. So that's another area that over the next month we are hoping to have that collaboration between the Chamber of Commerce and the Banks Association to have that data and pipeline being worked out.
Alisha, that was interesting. I'll go back to the one point that you mentioned right at the beginning on syndicated loans, because that reminded me that how important it is that it's not just a few front-running banks in the market doing climate action as a strategy, but actually all the banks having to do it, because otherwise you don't really get into that consortium lending. And a lot of the perceived risks in these emerging sectors, often syndicated loans have been the first step to get the things going in a lot of the advanced markets. But the presupposition is that all the banks in the local market are in that stage, because it's one thing to say rising tide lifts all the boats, but that presupposes the boats are able to lift up in the first place. Maybe let's go to Manish now. Last question to you. ICICI Banks has in place a sustainable financing framework. So in that context, what are some of the issues your bank has been facing while engaging with large corporate borrowers, especially in the hard-to-abate sectors? Over to you, Manish.
Yeah, so the first challenge was coming up with a framework itself. So we did lean on the sovereign green bond framework of the government of India, because of the absence of taxonomy, we really had to really select what kind of lending would really qualify as green or social or sustainability linked. So that was one document. Then we had the ICMA principles on sustainable lending, sustainable bond principles. So these are some of the documents which we have really taken help while creating the sustainable financing framework. One of the challenges that we face is about the decarbonization pathways for the hard to abate sectors themselves. So really, especially on the sustainability linked financing, there are challenges, and therefore a lot of engagement needs to be done with the borrowers. So from a hard to abate sector perspective, I would like to divide the borrowers into two buckets. The first bucket would comprise the large, I would say, responsible companies. There are export-oriented companies in the hard to abate sectors, and there are the tier one suppliers to the large companies or to these export-oriented companies. So this is the first bucket, wherein they have taken the lead to really look at what is impacting their businesses, to look at what should be their transition pathway. It need not necessarily be a decarbonization pathway at the moment, but can they really start looking at some of the process adjustments that they need to do to really minimize their carbon footprint from that perspective. So with these kind of companies, it is are driven more again from the investor expectation. It could be the regulations which are impacting them. So for example, export oriented units, which are focused on markets like the EU or the UK, they know that there is a carbon tax. The CBAM effectively is a carbon tax for them, which will really pinch them either on the top line or in terms of their profitability. So they have started taking action. They have started making enhanced disclosures. So the conversation with these kind of borrowers, tends to be more on the pricing aspects. There is very little that we have to do from a credit assessment, because they have established credit profiles. We have comfort on their business model. So even if it is adopting new technologies, there is a comfort based on their past track record of delivering on those projects. So it's more about the pricing, and therefore on a case-to-case basis, these are decisions which are being taken within the bank. It's a relationship-based approach that we have to take, and you know, I think one thing we have to realize, we don't see too much of a uh, I would say benefit coming on the funding side. So effectively, the bank is actually paying out of their pocket to really help these companies manage this entire adoption of new technology, moving towards low carbon uh, economy. Then there's a second bucket of companies which I would say are more the companies which would be manufacturing companies beyond the top 1,000 listed companies in India. There are real estate developers, there are shipping companies, and this is where they banks are engaging with them because there is an established relationship that exists over a period of time. They are part of an enhanced ecosystem that we are looking at as banks on other aspects of business. So these kind of companies, the approach is a little different. There, it is more about hand holding. It is more about capitalizing on the relationship to explain purpose, enabling adoption of mitigation and transition strategy. There's a lot of engagement which banks are doing with the senior management of these companies. So even within ICICI Bank, we actually do hold sessions with corporates on one-to-one basis, explaining to them, the benefit of adopting resilient strategies. We are encouraging them on disclosures. We are actually also helping them because we ourselves are engaging with climate tech startups. We are adopting technology, so we are seeing how we can really extend our learnings to these companies. So in either case, it is a demanding business scenario, but we have to go down that path. As I say, we have to take the baby steps, and I'm sure we will evolve over a period of time.
Yeah, and that is actually what makes this entire job so difficult for bankers, right? Because On one side, the relationships are strong, the business models, and there's a comfort to it. But at the same time, to work with them to sort of re-navigate or re-channelize, I mean, it's a bit, if I put it that way, on a lighter note, you cannot really upset the apple cart, but then if one of the apple becomes rotten, it sort of eats into the entire bundle. So how do you really balance it out? That is what makes the job difficult. But at the same time, it's something that needs to be done. It's a journey, it's an ongoing process, and hopefully sometime down the line, a lot of things will change. Let's take a look at the questions in the Q&A. We have a lot of questions there. If I can just, Adisha, maybe you could take the first one. In Sri Lanka's case, there's hardly much published climate pathways, targets, data, and so on. So how could banks look at developing portfolio analysis models or strategies? I mean, not just Sri Lanka, actually, this question is applicable for every geography, but maybe Adisha, you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think to be fair, there has been some direction that the government has put in place as well. So recently, the country passed through an act called Economic Transformation Act, and it brings into law that by 2050 we should achieve net zero status, and there has been a 2050 carbon net zero strategic plan or roadmap that has also been published by the government. So it goes into details of for each of the for energy and transport, for industry, for agriculture, but this is mainly on the decarbonization aspect and not so much on the resilience and the adaptive capacity aspect. But there is, I think, at the moment the government is working on revising the national adaptation plan, and it will come out by next year, which will provide more information. I think the challenge is that how do we condense those broader national targets and build it down to your own organization, and that's where I think for the banking sector, the Sustainable Banking Initiative, we are trying to do that, and also the private sector, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce is also working on in distilling it down to supporting the banks and the private sector to address it. There's also a lot of other organizations like the UN Global Compact Sri Lanka Network also doing some work in terms of SBTI and different other parameters. So overall, I agree it's a challenging aspect. And there's another issue is that there's multiple different documents. So there's also a climate prosperity plan. So they are touching on each government policy or each industry document is looking at the issue from different angles. So there can be some sort of confusion for an end user in terms of how to really, how to make it relevant to your own portfolio. I think to some degree we can look at understand the baseline, looking at our own portfolio, looking at the baseline. But I agree with Shamit that we have to also look at beyond our own individual organization. We have to look at it from a more macro perspective as well, and that's where data availability, data is. I mean, in most agencies record that data, but it's not shared as such. So that is a perennial problem that we are having. But it's something that has been that we're trying to address. That more data sharing.
Thank you. Thanks, Adisha. Yeah. Thanks, Adisha. Conrado, study on plantation crops and sequestration of carbon. In fact, auctusESG sometime back wrote a report on this sort of a topic with TMG of Germany. I'll ask my colleagues if they can share it with you publicly. Andrea, in South Africa, are you recommending to clients to use disclosure frameworks launched by the Johannesburg Exchange? Siloshini, are you able to answer this, or should we take this later? Maybe let's move to the next question. Abhishek is asking if sustainability-linked instruments are being scrutinized by some regulators globally. for low financial implications tied to sustainability targets? How can banks work on making it a more robust instrument? Anjali, do you want to take a stab at this one on sustainability linked instruments?
Sure, certainly. As I mentioned, I come back to the first point of saying that when we're talking about sustainability, generally it could be, as we understand the labels today, it's a combination of the green plus the social angles to it. Each taxonomy today seems to be defining what qualifies as social separately. I could give you an example. For instance, the erstwhile HDFC Limited was a mortgage finance company. We've been doing housing loans for the past 45 years. We call them housing loans today. They mostly qualify as social loans if they are really targeting the first-time homeowners or people who are in the economically weaker sections or low-income groups. Each bank then needs to identify their strengths where they have certain portfolios that can align with the requirements of the bond investors, for instance. And unfortunately, there are no clear answers to this. But the main important part is whatever route you take, be transparent and open about, how you're doing the labeling for these products.
Sure, thanks,
Sourajit, I can
Anjali.
probably add to that.
Yeah.
So one is, disclosure. Second is, I think, especially on the project financing side, what we are seeing, because sustainability linked instruments are more about, the future, wherein the companies need to really achieve certain milestones. And especially in project financing, like in the renewable sector, we are seeing that there are, lenders, engineers, which are getting appointed. Upfront covenants are being decided between the borrowers and the lenders, and these are being monitored and reported.
Thanks, Manish, and thanks, Anjali. There is one interesting question here from Setaita. I mean, I'm just focusing on one aspect of that question regarding development banks sourcing funding by raising bonds and the issue related to forex risk. So currency hedging is a huge issue in a lot of developing countries. Manish, do you want to take a stab at this? That how can they look at this currency hedging aspect?
Yes, so this is definitely a big challenge, and in fact, we have also evaluated if we have to really raise resources outside the country. So there is a additional swap cost which is involved. So I think it is more a discussion between the borrower and the lender, which needs to happen. Probably they'll have to share. One aspect to be considered is that in case foreign currency is being borrowed, then it correspondingly it can be used for foreign currency lending, so that an automatic natural hedge can be built into the structure. Otherwise, of course, the cost will have to be discussed between the lenders and uh, the development bank, the lenders, which are the development banks, and the borrowers, which would be the banks and institutions. Obviously, we have seen in the past when foreign currency loans were a popular product in India. I'm talking about 2010-11. Costs were being shared between the bank and the ultimate borrower.
But in
Thanks.
India, at least
Yeah.
in India, the Reserve Bank of India has mandated that corporates or, let's say, housing finance companies, for instance, when they are raising overseas resources, the principal amount needs to be hedged. So they are ensuring that even if you're raising this 5-year money, you do have a corresponding hedge. So one of the good instruments that was there to prevent the foreign exchange risk was what they called as the masala bonds or the rupee denominated bonds. And there are variants of these kind of bonds in different countries where the investor bears the forex risk. But unfortunately, in India, there was some tax issue on the withholding tax, and that product did well for a short time, but then eventually it just lost traction.
Sure. Thanks, Anjali. Thanks, Manish. We're almost close to time. Maybe just one last question. I see Siloshini is back online. So Siloshini, there's a question from Andrea in the Q&A. She's asking that in South Africa's case, are you recommending to clients to use the disclosure frameworks launched by the Johannesburg Exchange? Are you able to take a go at that, Sulochini?
Yes, I think on our side as the DBSA, we don't play in the bond market as much as we, other competitors in the SA space do, but absolutely the JSE requirements on bonds and so forth are quite key. We've also internally started to work around our own sustainability issuance framework. And obviously, it aligns to the JSE's guidance as well as ICMA and so forth, that the JSE requirements are also aligned to. So absolutely, we do that.
Thanks, Sulochini. There was a question by Soujanya in the in the chat box, but I think a large part of that has already been answered by a number of our speakers related to SME topics related to SMEs and taxonomies. So anyway, with this, let me let me quickly thank all the speakers and all the listeners who've joined in today. Thank you for giving us your time. It was a lot of interesting perspectives and insights. I will once again ask my colleague to share the report link in the chat box for those who missed it earlier. And with this, I'll just hand it over to my colleague Cymroan for closing comments. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sourajit. As we're approaching the end of this webinar, once again, on behalf of auctusESG and the ABA, I'd like to thank everyone, to all the speakers, panelists for their time, insights, the answers to some of the questions on key aspects of climate transition. So Anjali, Sulochini, Adisha, Manish, Sourajit, Austin, I believe, had to leave, but thank you so much for your insights and contributions today.